Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Beautiful evening. It's a shame to be inside, but I think you'll find that it will be worthwhile. This is the annual lecture of the Centre for the Humanities and Health, and we're really pleased and privileged to have Mathias Wirth with us from the University of Hamburg. He was born in the Cologne, Bonn area. He did his PhD on obedience. He's a theologist and philosopher by training. His main interests are actually in the philosophy of death and dying and compassionate forms of dying, including killing. He's also interested in anthropology and ethics in medicine. He's interested in otherness and diversity, and actually that's what attracted him to come to spend 3 months with us last year on a Fritz Thyssen scholarship, which he holds actually at the Charité hospital in Berlin, although his academic appointment is actually in Hamburg in the Department of History and Ethics of Medicine. He's also interested in intersexuality and transsexuality and in Hebrew philosophy and theology, so very diverse and broad interests. But tonight he's going to be, and I perhaps should say, he's picked up a string of awards ever since he was an undergraduate, all sorts of national scholarships. But tonight he's going to be talking to us about feelings as things, Hermann Schmitz's Phenomenology and the realness of medical humanities. Thank you very much for coming, Mathias.
Yeah, many thanks, Brian, for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for coming to listen to such a strange topic. Feelings as things sounds quite paradox, and it of course is, but that makes philosophy interesting. And I try to show you a fantastic world, I think, which is part of the thinking of Hermann Schmitz, who is a still living, very, very old German philosopher who begins to be part of the philosophical establishment. He used to be an insider tip. So this is an opportunity for me, an interesting opportunity to introduce to you a German philosophy that has not been much recognized in the English-speaking countries. That is my opinion, will begin after the attention to his philosophy in Germany develops more and more. Yeah, I will give you first an insight of what I want to do tonight. This is like the steps of argumentation. I try to, first of all, introduce you into the field of phenomenology and medical humanities, and I try to compare both. And by doing that, I think you will get a clue of what both, in a very general sense, mean. And afterwards, I will introduce to you Hermann Schmitz's new phenomenology, which is like a very ambitious plan. I mean, he wrote like 46 books. His works on the history of philosophy encompass over 10,000 pages. So introducing you to his philosophy is like, it's like a beginning, I would say. And then we get closer to tonight's topics. I will explain to you and discuss feelings as half things. This is the thesis of Hermann Schmitz. And the last point will be putting all this together and trying to outline parts of what that could mean for medical humanities. And again, I mean, medical humanities is like a very big term, so two very big concepts are seen together here as a beginning, as I said. Okay, let's start. What phenomenology and medical humanities share at first sight is their interest in observing, describing, and debating what is somehow beneath the surface of what appears as hidden reality in a certain, for instance, medical context. Also, both focus on human experiences and their relatedness. At least the phenomenology of Schmitz does this explicitly, following the dogma of wanting to watchfully describe much and construing less. That is what the philosophical phenomenology tries as a method, which does not allow for quick explanations, which tend to annihilate individual experiences. Therefore, phenomenology has been defined as anti-philosophy, which does not want to fall into the trap of explaining things no one knows with words no one understands. Schmitz, in my opinion, does the opposite, as the formula of feelings as things indicates. He uses ordinary words, but says extraordinary things. Also, a medical humanities program is debated as to pay much thicker attention to the social, human, and cultural context. There's a quote, as you can see, in which those accounts, mental illness, suffering, intervention, and cure, as well as the bodies to which they attend, become both thinkable and visible. Regarding both concerns, thinkability and visibility of the body in the medical context, Schmitz's phenomenology offers some insights which are as interdisciplinary as medical humanities appears in its best cases. Moreover, medical humanities and phenomenology share the same criticism of the current reductionism within many fields of medicine. Apart from justifiable reductions, science alone provides insufficient overall foundation for holistic understanding of the interaction between health, illness, and disease, as Brian Horowitz wrote. Even though the paradigm of holism needs critical inspection, both medical humanities and phenomenology add a perspective to the exploration of human nature, and that is the perspective of the first person. That shall animate recognizing the human at the center of healthcare encounters, as medical problems are much more than pathologies of an organ. In line with what quite recently has been called critical medical humanities, Schmitz's phenomenology, and of course other such approaches, may be a fine conversation partner for the working out of a new reality, which is announced to be a topic of critical medical humanities. There is no doubt that phenomenology must be a vital part of this attempt, in my opinion. Come to my chapter 2, Attention to the Whole World of a Person, Hermann Schmitz, New Phenomenology. Hermann Schmitz, born in 1928 in Leipzig, which is in eastern Germany, was professor of philosophy at the University of Kiel, which is in the north, from 1971 until 1993. And has, as I said in the beginning, written 46 books, which seems quite a lot. Brian told me this afternoon that he knows a guy who wrote over 100 books, so it depends on how you see it, but I think 46 books is quite a lot. Amongst these 46 books, which are, one is written about love, one is about Adolf Hitler, so a wide range of topics, one is his System of Philosophy, which encompasses more than 5,000 pages and is kind of his main work. And it's mainly about the whole topic of corporeality. Although his entire project of a philosophical system has been criticized just for his claim, as you may know, after Hegel and the critique of the Frankfurt School, daring another system of philosophy sounds awkwardly fallen out of time. Schmitz, rather unimpressed by such predictable criticism, considers his thinking, astonishingly, in confrontation with this title, relativistic. For a long time, as I said, Schmitz was only an insider tip, a non-mainstream philosopher who was, most astonishingly, more read by psychologists and physicians than by other philosophers. Meanwhile, the German philosophical establishment began reading Schmitz. There's even an academic society that deals with his work, and philosophers interested in Schmitz began to make their careers. Internationally, Schmitz's work found almost none attention so far. There is no English translation, for instance. Still, there seems something strange and foreign with Schmitz, which might be reason why it took so long that he found some recognition. On the one hand, Schmitz' work seems simply different in comparison to that of his colleagues. Söhngen, a philosopher, compares his philosophical work with working on an atlas. While most philosophers highlight significant spots and deal with them, Schmitz works on tiny places, very slow, with much attention, very detailed, rather helping pedestrians than car drivers. So it's more for the inside. On the other hand, Schmitz' self-esteem, calling his thinking a revolution of anthropology and phenomenology, calling his phenomenology new phenomenology, understanding himself and his thinking as salvation of the first person's perspective, etc., can be seen as a symptom of something highly problematic. But those not being hostile towards Schmitz assume that this access of self-affirmation is necessary when one breaks so tremendously with common trails of thinking. Schmitz himself defines the task of philosophy as reflection about finding myself in my surrounding. And Schmitz adds some questions which help to understand what this means, or what he means by this subject-centered definition of philosophy. He asks, how is courage possible although there is misery, guilt, and death? Or, what is truly me, and what is only a masquerade? In his work, he gives a clue to these kinds of questions, referring to involuntary life experiences. And all these big terms I will list here. Unvoluntary life experiences, in German unwillkürliche Lebenserfahrungen. These kinds of always corporal experiences, such as narrowness, whiteness, direction, tension, swelling, intensity, freshness, rhythm, are the points from which Schmitz debates meaning and importance of life. To these experiences we oftentimes do not pay much attention, although they are the vital pulse of human existence and shape the actual being, behavior, thinking. Schmitz wants to rediscover them and illuminate their cardinal importance for being and acting as a self. Schmitz then accuses the entire philosophy of having undermined the first person's perspective, of how it exactly feels to be a person A and experiencing B. Schmitz wants to examine and describe much closer than any philosophy or phenomenology before the different qualities, including the corporal, of experiencing life. Doing so, he does not hold on to the dualistic framework of separated body and mind and criticizes this juxtaposition. The fact of being an I at a concrete time and place that has been debated as possible illusion within philosophy, according to Schmitz, becomes most evident in being hit by strong emotions, as it occurs within the feeling of burning shame, being shocked, within a sudden flip or sudden pain. And the shame example is Schmitz's main example of showing that he always writes very pictured about burning in shame. It is especially the degree of narrowness which comes with these effects that causes the experience of doubtlessly being the one who burns in shame, is shocked, or suffers in pain. These moments Schmitz names primitive presence, in German primitive Gegenwart. This is not meant deprecatory, but is qualified as rare condition in which here, now, being, this, I, are melt together. This is his definition. It's a quote from his book. Here, now, being, this, I, makes a primitive presence. The opposite of this fundamental experience of narrowness and identity is whiteness. Following Schmitz, this can be experienced when calming down, when taking a nap, before falling asleep, after orgasm. All these are examples taken from Schmitz. In these conditions, the identity flows into wideness and allows for later contracting into narrowness again. The point of these phenomenological descriptions is to reveal that a person is not mainly a soul or mind closed up in some interiority of the person. Instead, corporeality constitutes life, dramatically shifting between narrowness and wideness. Importantly, Schmitz does not understand the person as being first and foremost a single entity. If that were the case, the whole phenomenological methodology would be a severe problem, because describing feelings of person A would not have anything to do with the feelings of person B. Therefore, phenomenological attention would be of non-interest to anyone else except persons A and B. Schmitz, on the contrary, understands the person being corporeal, involved into the world, being affected by the surrounding atmospheres and others. Schmitz terms this corporeal communication and describes the fact that we can be dramatically affected by others. Such affection can also lead to a sort of ban, which means we cannot escape, at least for a while. Schmitz sees the other not as an enemy, but as a partner, and so it is permeability which allows for more general phenomenological descriptions. Therefore, access to testimonies of others is possible and appears as highly interesting, perhaps as a mirror. Chapter 3, Attention to the whole world of feelings, feelings as half-things. Generally, feelings are seen as belonging to the inner world of a person and are considered a psychic condition of an individual. But they are not caught. They find ways of expression. Language, action, bodily signs can mirror feelings. The feeling itself remains an inner condition, and the assumption of a strict disjunction between the inner world of feelings and the outer world of facts characterizes the common belief about feelings. Now, Schmitz acknowledges the success of such reductionism, which meant focusing exclusively on material aspects, as science, technology, and medicine have done and still mainly do. Apart from the undeniable and practical success of these reductionist methods of science, although it is not for certain that a more complex appreciation of the person would have hindered science, I think, Schmitz stresses how this leads to a one-sided and poorer reception of human experiences. With his position against the solely inwardness of feelings, he opposes not only the aforementioned mathematic, technological disinterest in feelings, but also idealistic concepts which judge the material of no and non-relevance for the person and favor the so-called homo clausus, which is the human who is mainly something inward. Now, when Schmitz defines feelings as atmospheres, which is another main aspect of his philosophy, he irritates the commonplace of the interiority of feelings and allocates them also to the world of exteriority. This can be seen as a revolutionary claim. Feelings as atmospheres can be experienced as an own quality of the room. Thus, they are a power that literally takes room and outpours and grasps someone corporeal. In German, he writes feelings as räumlich ergossene, leiblich ergreifende Mächte, which means grasping someone corporally. Here, Schmitz's specific understanding of the term corporeality becomes decisive. The body can be examined, touched, seen. Corporeality, on the contrary, is what can only be experienced. And Schmitz always says that the corporal happens in the vicinity of the body. Again, the body is what can be examined, touched, and seen. Corporeality is what can only be experienced. Again, revolutionary is that he understands feelings as atmospheres in the sense that they are of an independent character. This is not meant in the sense that an intense feeling may fall over a person that can only passively experience, for instance, massive grief. Schmitz states that feelings can exist apart from a subject. For instance, within a landscape, the weather conditions, or in certain rooms. Feelings are not captured in souls. Out of Schmitz, and with saying that, Schmitz really wants to free feelings. After this foretaste of Schmitz's phenomenology of feelings, a closer look on the main terms and underlying concepts is necessary in order to identify those aspects that may be of importance in the perspective of medical humanities and a different understanding of the person within the medical context. Schmitz distinguishes, first of all, between feelings and being affected by something. And being affected means hunger, pain, or tiredness. These also cause a corporal reaction, but can be better observed and predicted than feelings. The second important term are the atmospheres. And according to Schmitz, atmospheres mean the entire occupation of room, for instance, with silence. But the whole occupation term sounds too strong. Atmospheres do not dictate anything. They can be affirmed or rejected. Also, depending on the situation a person is in, an atmosphere may only gently affect someone. Schmitz uses the example of a thief in a church. Although he will sense the specific atmosphere, the thief has no time and mood for paying attention to this atmosphere. Schmitz's atmospheres can be defined as moods with spatial influence, which means they affect people corporeally. Another word for atmospheres Schmitz uses is aura, which accompanies people, places, things. He quotes Goethe and his Faustus when he secretly enters Gretchen's chamber, which is the lady he loves. In this room, Faustus senses an atmosphere that is already in this room. According to Schmitz, this atmosphere is awaiting the person entering. And he describes this atmosphere as a feeling of silence, order, and satisfaction that characterizes Gretchen's chamber. Here the connection between phenomenology and medical humanities in terms of methodology becomes obvious. Schmitz focuses throughout his books on sources of the experience in the first person's perspective. He reads literature, autobiographies, diaries, patient protocols, etc. The same does medical humanities with its narrative interest when focusing on poetry, drama, films, etc. And again, phenomenology and medical humanities seem methodologically comparable as paying attention to the personal dimension of the experience of being ill, suffering, having pain, recognizing meaning in life, reorganizing meaning in life, etc. Art would be another example for something from which a certain atmosphere enters a room. Once someone is not preoccupied with the possible meaning of art, the special character of art in the sense of causing atmospheres, causing a certain power can be felt. Another and simple example would be what all children are scared of, the witch cottage as a lonely house in the dark forest. which has a certain atmosphere, we all know which is waiting at these places, Schmitz holds. Schmitz more generally understands atmospheres as something that leads to the experience of a certain presence within a room or at a place. Third, and accordingly, feelings are spatial and wide-stretched atmospheres, which is also a quote from his book. Examples are the cheerful atmosphere at a party that affects those entering, or the phenomenon of, I don't know if you say that in English, thick air. In Germany we say dicke Luft when there's conflicts and someone else comes into that scenery and sends this thick air. Feelings are, as indicated above, nothing only within the interiority of a person. That's the point. Therefore, Schmitz's theory of feelings is eccentric. Feelings are seen as independent from people. They exist in rooms. Schmitz also knows about feelings and their atmospheres which are just private, such as bitterness after an insult, which a neighbor may not feel. But as Schmitz sketches it, feelings are not notoriously private. They can also be collective experiences, such as panic or courage within groups. May this as it be, in both cases, feelings create atmospheres that are introduced as an objective reality and are not only within a person, but characterize the surrounding. Thus, atmospheres are interpersonal. Feelings can be interpersonal as well as personal. The last point that all this wants to go to, and was like the preparation, are the half things. In opposition to things, they do not continue. That is like the very basic definition of half things. They do not continue. Half things appear, disappear, come back. They can be interrupted, which is impossible for things. A desk like this will remain a desk until it's broken. Examples of half things would be the wind, a voice, pain, a melody, noise, and of course, feelings. Also, problems someone is thinking about very intensively and which might hinder falling asleep and all that are considered such half things. But here begins the problem with half things, such as feelings. Since they are vague, coming and going, often unpredictable, a scientific age we are living in and its computers that are built upon prediction, measuring, etc., are unable to deal with half things or simply reinterpret them as things, as Schmitz holds. Wind, for instance, is not seen as a half thing, but as moving air. Although such a definition is unable to give an entire picture of what wind is and how it feels. This scientific reductionism is also mirrored in a widely held assumption of ordinary people who not seldom prefer yes or no factuality and ignore the unsecure, unclear, bewildering, diffuse that also and obviously characterizes our lives. However, Schmitz is keen on stressing the objective character of half things, and with this, the ignorance of science, when pinpointing the objective presence of all sorts of feelings in our daily life, which are as characteristic for it as trees and buildings next to the streets we used to walk. That is an obvious point, that our mood and our feelings characterize how we feel and how we live. The objective formula also means that the atmospheres are not a projection from the inside of a person to the outside. Now, Schmitz, throughout his work, repeats indicators for the objective character of atmospheres, which is like a strong thesis, which allow, according to him, to understand feelings as half things. These indicators are, for instance, the authority of feelings, especially of mourning, access to feelings of others, in compassion, for instance, or the security with which people express feelings of happiness, anger, or anxiety in a specific and to all understandable manner. That not only atmospheric conditions but centric feelings are seen as objective entities has led obviously to harsh criticism also amongst his followers. One main argument against Schmitz' objective interest would be that by stating that feelings are not subjective conditions anymore, Schmitz also does violence to the subjective first person's perspective that he wants to valorize. But that can be seen also in another, the opposite way. When announcing feelings as more than a highly private and others not interesting part of human experience, then Schmitz does something to rediscover feelings. However, this means following the idea that only those things matter which are of an at least half objective character. The subjective alone remains problematic and difficult to pay attention to, because in order to put weight on the subjectivity of feelings, Schmitz declares them to be objects. Although there is some ratio in this concept, the question must be allowed whether this is really a technique to consider the first-person perspective. My last chapter, which tries to put things together, attention to the whole world of feelings, half things in medical humanities. Schmitz' phenomenology holds that feelings are not primarily subjective or private conditions, but thrilling, activating, and moving powers which affect individuals as well as groups. Wanting to describe and to understand people in certain situations, for instance in the special case of illness or hospitalization, attention to feelings of all people involved is not only something psychologically rational, but essential to the reality of being sick, being in a hospital, being a patient, being a doctor, being a relative, etc. Assumptions, decisions, interactions, medical interventions do not take place within a neutral surrounding. Especially the room of sickness and the hospital is filled with atmospheres aplenty. These atmospheres affect patients, doctors, nurses, relatives corporally. Some jump out of joy, others whine, others sit as if broken, and others have their heads down. Atmospheres, more generally, cause the feeling of lust or dislike, which reveals feelings are of paramount importance for understanding and action. With lust, everything, or German Lust, everything is something, but with dislike, anything is nothing. Feelings, according to Schmitz, are the most important half things in life, because from them comes the weight, tenderness, glint, and turbidity from which anything begins to be important. Schmitz' apology of feelings seems to be highly relevant for the medical humanities, as it casts light to covered backgrounds of living, acting, deciding, suffering, interacting, operating. Under the successful scientific technical imperative of modern medicine, atmospheres, feelings, and with this corporeality are undermined. Under the technological scientific prejudice about reality, the concrete I of patients, doctors, nurses, relatives, etc. seems not relevant. N equals to 1. A cohort of just one patient does not make science. It is not relevant. It does not make a study. It may only be a case. Statistics count, which is an important but highly abstract and impersonal way of valorizing majorities, although caregivers face panic, uncertainty, fear, denial, and disorientation of individuals. Medical humanities, with their multi-perspective, focus on these first-person experiences, and Schmitz' phenomenology offers a way of understanding them as a crucial part of being a person. I come to my conclusion. A dialogue between medical humanities and phenomenology, for instance the one of Hermann Schmitz, and their specific attention to the first person's perspective may help to specifically rediscover a focus that began to be undermined in European medicine when bodily examination was more and more established in medical practice. It was Leopold Auenbrugger in Austria in the mid of the 18th century who examined his patients by tapping and palpating the bodies in search for liquids, gases, pressure, etc., which is still a diagnostic method that requires the patient to be silent. Short after that, in 1819, René Laennec introduced the stethoscope and the principle of auscultation. Again, the patient had to be silent during the examination. And this reveals a continuing development in the history and practice of medicine. Before technologies such as palpating, auscultation, or today X-ray or neuroimaging, etc., determined medical examination, the main diagnostic focus was on what the patient had to say. The main source of information in these days was the patient. And meanwhile, patients seem to be silenced as subjective and introspective awareness of the body is not necessary anymore. Personal information of patients may only deliver further information to the core findings of the technological diagnosis. Now, both medical humanities and phenomenology may animate a climate in which caregivers begin to act in the name of the patients as persons and not only in the name of diagnostic data. Acting with and in the name of patients requires to understand the main forces of an individual. According to Schmitz, these forces can be found in others' feelings. They are not encapsulated and far, but become obvious in spatial atmospheres which surround patients. Atmospheres are in the room. Caregivers and everyone involved has already access, as Schmitz would claim, speaking of shared situations, gemeinsame Situationen in German. These shared situations build on the atmospheric character of feelings and may be the key for applying Schmitz' phenomenology to medical humanities and medical practice. Thank you for your attention.
Can you take questions? Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed.
I mean, that's obviously a tension within the whole work. That on the one hand, he wants to pay much and close attention to the first person's perspective, and on the other hand, he objectifies that very much. I think the clue to that, or one way of seeing it and putting it together, is understanding that he wants to stress the crucial importance of feelings in general. That is his point, saying that when people live and act and behave and decide and all that, that this is based on feelings. And the point is that there are some which they are shared and some which are just something the individual experiences. So I think that is true. I mean, we make this experience. Sometimes we are alone in our feelings, and once in a while we share that in groups. The point is, apart from this description, that in both cases, these feelings are nothing which are like behind or something you can pay attention to or whatever. They are decisive for being a person, for being something. And I think that is the point which helps us to kind of rescue the objectifying thing that is behind it. But I mean, in the end, he says, well, the whole atmosphere topic shows that we are related. So even in moments when one person has a feeling for him or herself, it doesn't mean that we don't have access to it, because we have the same experience. So what he's saying is that feelings are something we can talk about, and that means we have some experience with that by our own. And that would be like a second aspect I would add, showing that although in a situation you can be alone with your feeling, they are not so unique that no one else could talk about it. And this makes that is the whole meaning of half things. We can talk about a tree, we can talk about the building, we can describe it, we can analyze it, and the same holds true for feelings. But I know the tension, I think there are so many ways to go to it. That is always a problem with Schmitz, that you have the feeling you have it, and then you read further and you think, well, no, that sounds very objectifying, and then he goes back and you have the feeling, well, that's fair and a very good way of paying attention to the first person's perspective. Yeah, it's both, I guess. I think what Schmitz would say is that we need an entire new way of looking at how we are as human beings. I mean, the whole medical situation you described implies that we say the biological base of being a human person is the one and only, is the most important. And I mean, of course, that is part of us. We wouldn't be in that room if that wouldn't work. But that is just part of it. So the point is that, and that is what Schmitz does with his philosophy, he suggests to really rediscover the importance of feelings, which means, as I have said, seeing that they are the main force of deciding, of wanting, of whatever. And I think that might be I mean, I don't have a political agenda or anything, but I mean, that would be the interesting point, to try to get away from the idea that feelings are something, which is something, I mean, we all have it, but I mean, it doesn't really matter kind of situation. I mean, we all know from our own perspective how important they are and how depressing that can be, or how happy they can make us, but in a general, especially scientific awareness, they appear like a little bit like shishi. So yeah, it requires a new attention to being human. And I mean, there are whole programs about that. I mean, the whole thing saying we need a holistic medicine and all that, I mean, all that has been seen. That is not new. The new thing is that Hermann Schmitz gives a new clue why. And he says, well, feelings are the main force of our action, of our thinking, of our being in a room, of interaction. I mean, of course, the whole feelings as things or half things issue in the philosophy of Schmitz has been highly debated. The corporeality topic is much more common sense, meanwhile, but the whole thing and half thing topic is difficult. The question is, why does he do that? Why does he emphasize the character of things as of feelings as things? First off, he tries to do phenomenology, and he tries to describe things as they are. And he says, well, feelings do have characteristics we observe concerning normal things. And that means they can be described by others. They have a certain power in the room. They can be analyzed. So what he's trying to do is, in opposition to a philosophical tradition that he criticizes, he says, all this should lead to observing feelings as something we should take them into consideration. The problem is, he has like a difficult term for it, I don't quote that. He says, once we have feelings only in our souls, which is like the common assumption, there is no way of talking about it. They are not important, he says, because they are encapsulated. They are your own. They are highly private. Why talking about it? How could another person refer to it? So these two aspects, first, an empirical, phenomenological thing, that feelings behave almost as things because they have an impact. That is the first reason why he does it. And secondly, he opposes to a philosophical tradition that tended to understand feelings as something highly private. And that meant, I mean, that first off is neutral, but that always meant to not taken that serious. So it's kind of a political thing, maybe. A first interesting answer to your question or to your comment would be that amongst physicians, especially psychiatrists, or the whole field of psychiatry, read and still reads Hermann Schmitz. There is actually a chair at the University of Heidelberg within the clinic of psychiatry, where there is a Karl Jaspers professor, and he is one of the most keen person into Hermann Schmitz. That is because he has written one book where he exemplifies this whole corporeality topic and the whole narrowness, wideness thing to especially schizophrenia. I mean, there are several things I could say. The first is that he says, well, the whole issue of calling people with certain special behavior ill or mentally sick or whatever is an example for narrowing our understanding of feelings. He says this is exactly a symptom of not paying attention to the whole variety of feelings. And I mean, then he does something that is commonly done in a way to say, well, the mentally ill person is a person who sees something different, and in a certain society it has been labeled as a problem. What he says concerning that is that this is an example how Western civilizations only allow for a certain form of feeling, and he suggests to open that, saying that feelings happen in the field of narrowness and wideness, and there is no one deciding about the amount. And he says that people suffering from mental illness usually are much more in the situation of narrowness, which common people usually have once in a while. We are once in a wild field, scared. We are once in a wild, bewildered or whatever. But the fact that people who are called mentally ill may experience that over a longer time or more often, in his opinion, does not allow to call them sick. Some ideas, but yeah. Interesting, of course. I mean, that is always a question you have to ask in philosophy. Where's the link to the reality? The first thing I would say to your first comment, what Schmitz says is, well, we all have learned not to pay close attention to our feelings. And that is why, yeah, I mean, perhaps, yeah, I mean, that's certainly different. But that is one of his observations, that he says once we are in a scientific world, all these feelings are something we obviously have, but we don't pay attention to it. And that leads to confusion, that leads to the fact that we read his books with some kind of, well, this is a new world, but on the other hand, we find things we know. And that is an example, at least how I read it, that is kind of true, that we are not used to pay close attention to our feelings, which might cause that we find they are much confusing and all that. That might be different in a world that Schmitz suggests, where feelings are seen as highly important and as something really governs our daily life and our self-conception and all that. That would be my first point, that we might not be used to focusing on feelings. The other thing, of course, what you described concerning your first point is, well, exactly because of what you described, that feelings are coming and going and are developing and all that, he calls it half things. I mean, this is exactly his definition. He says that is the difference to a chair. A chair is a chair, and that continues, but feelings don't. That might be a theoretical thing, why he calls it half things. Your second point, give me a keyword again.
So I was talking about self-recognition and how different people...
Yeah, exactly, how people can be so differently behave to atmospheres, yeah. Yeah, exactly, yeah, that's a big point. Well, I think Schmitz knows that once in a while atmospheres are collective, or they always are because they are in the room, but depending on the mood of a person, I gave the thief example, people may not want to pay attention or not be able to pay attention. But his argument would be, you could explain them to these people, to your colleagues who are, I don't know, in a rush or just not in the mood to pay attention. They would be able to understand if you describe the atmosphere that is in the room, for instance, I don't know, anxiety or whatever. That is what Schmitz at least would say. He would say these atmospheres are nothing which is so private that we could not talk about it, which does not mean that we always have to pay attention to it. And I mean, we learn not to pay attention to it. That is something Schmitz will also say. We learn not to pay attention to atmospheres. We think we make decisions in a neutral surrounding. One example he gives us the judge. When the judge laughs, how do you call what the judge does in the end? The judgment, yeah. The judgment will be totally different in comparison to a judge in the mood of hatred. But we all believe that a judge should be neutral, and we hope that most of the time he is. And Schmitz says he's never.
I mean, that sensitivity is worse at the last physical session on Mathias.
Yeah.
That's been shown repeatedly.
Right. So yeah, I mean, these are important questions. And I'm not saying that Schmitz saw them all, but yeah, as a first little explanation. I mean, your sensitivity point, I guess, is very important. I mean, there are many concepts where sensitivity plays an important role. The question that is always important, I guess, is why. I mean, that sensitivity towards patients is something important, I guess all of us would agree to. The point with Hermann Schmitz is that he gives some reason why we exactly should do that.
I think what your point does raise is the whole idea. I mean, there's a whole discipline in biology now called electrobiology, where they're particularly interested in the electric fields that particular cells create. This whole idea that there is a field effect of various kinds of phenomena, and it's rather like an atmospheric, it's rather like an atmosphere. It's got spatiality. It occupies a volume. It's not a surface. Because Schmitz is very concerned about the difference between volume and space and surface. But one of the things that strikes me is that just to try and kind of see whether it's possible to pull some things together or to see where they sort of interact, is that one of the things that I'm interested in is how this kind of theory of emotion plays into very important notions within modern medicine, such as rapport. You know, what is rapport in atmospheric terms? In modern medicine, it's a kind of form of communication. It's a sort of channel that works or doesn't work or half works. Whereas in atmospheric terms, it could be something very different. That's one. That's one thing. Another might be something like sort of thing that Neil was talking about, but bringing in some notion of stigma. This idea that it's not necessarily the irrational, but something about the collective response to mood is a kind of outcast, punishing, despoilation effect. The third thing I'm really interested in is this idea that James raised, which is, I think, something to do with, do you get interference? So, and that's again partly something to do with kind of field forces. In fact, is some of his philosophical thought analogous to or parasitic on physical field theory, or is that just nothing to do with it? Because the other thing that he's interested in is music, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the question is, where is a melody? Why doesn't melody have any location? And this idea of Stimmung, the attunement, which is rather like rapport.
I mean, concerning your last point, I would say, since Schmitz does not want to understand feelings as something which belongs to mind or soul, his whole conception is obviously open to something material, to something we can measure, and the field, the atmospheres or electric fields or whatever, would be a part of its objective character. So I think that could be, or that could open a window kind of to imply all these interests or questions. Because, I mean, what he's doing is he is opposing the dualistic segregation, I mean, as many ones do, yeah? But what he does is he gives a certain concept where that goes together. The more somatic things as well as the more psychic things, which implies, again, that all these material things that you described, that are always seen as a base of all these feelings and all that, that could be implied and are not a opposition or to the concept of Schmitz. So I think that works together, acknowledging that there is something that we can measure with scientific methods, which, again, in Schmitz's eyes would always mean that is not that, or that doesn't mean that science gets the whole picture. I mean, that is his point. He says science is important, and he says they are successful, no wonder, but they never get the main point, and that is also like a commonplace. His point is that science only focuses a tiny part. That is his point, really. He said that makes sense and it is important, but saying that feelings are the main force means that the biological base of being a person and all that is important, but only the tiny place. And we would say the opposite in general. This is exactly what he's saying. He's saying the witch cottage and the atmosphere is there, is waiting for the persons to come. What you described in your first picture is like common sense. That is what we all would agree to, and that is what we experience. He says these atmospheres are in the room objectively. They are waiting there. Like, I mean, of course, that is interesting and much debated about and criticized, of course, but his point is that there is something waiting, something grasping a person, and that requires that it has been in the room before.
Oh, wow. I'll have to think about that, because I didn't think he could be saying that, but that's fantastic. At least I know what he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, that is the astonishing thing about his philosophy, yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things that's always struck me, that it does seem as if there are certain things about medicine that kind of fit with that. So sort of miasmatic theory, the idea of a miasma, or almost, yes, well, yes, okay. Humoral theory, which of course is very within the individual, but there's something kind of spatial about humoral theory. It seems to me, it's got spatiality, even though it's sort of within the body. It's a kind of field, you know. It's, I don't know, but it seems to me that there is some sort of resonance between some medical ideas or former medical ideas and this kind of theory of atmosphere and half thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good thing, to try to apply philosophy to concrete fields and questions. The good thing with Schmitz, I think, especially also from my experience with teaching medical students in medical history and ethics, is that he gives some reasons for these common sense assumptions in all these fields. I mean, that's always the problem, that we all think, well, talking to patients, paying attention to feelings is something we all agree to, but why do we do that? And Schmitz, apart from all these difficulties that obviously come with his concept, gives some insights which help to ground that. That's what I would say. Yeah. I mean, the question is what I think and what Hermann Schmitz thinks. Hermann Schmitz obviously would say atmospheres are a result of feelings, and or have to do with feelings, and the definition, or per definition, they don't last all the time. So, concerning your first point, atmospheres can go, but they can come back. So it's not that atmospheres persist all the time. That would be a normal thing. The whole half thing topic refers to the fact that they obviously disappear. So after thunder, 2 days later, there's like the nicest summer day. Of course, the atmosphere changed. I mean, that is obvious. I'm not so into these concepts, what I can say is that in general, for instance, compared to other phenomenological concepts, what he stresses, or Schmitz at least, Schmitz reading Husserl, Schmitz reading Merleau-Ponty, he always claims for himself that he is the only one who paid much attention to the first person's perspective. The others tried but didn't. Concerning the theories you're mentioning, I'm not so sure. Concerning a general philosophy of feelings, which would be another perspective to read that, at least in the German philosophical context, Schmitz is one position in that. I mean, there are other positions, of course, but Schmitz is one position in the whole debate. I think Schmitz would respond and say, well, there are so many examples where that works, where people go into a museum and in front of a picture, they have certain things that happen. I don't think he would say that such a empirical test really falsify or whatever due to his theory, because what he says is that people don't have to respond to atmospheres. But the fact that they can be grasped by it, that they can be moved, shows that they can be atmospheres. So what you're trying to do is to be very scientific, and Hermann Schmitz wants to be corporal in another sense. So in German I would say what you're saying is a Kategorienfehler, a mirror of categories. I understand the question and it's interesting, but I think Schmitz would not be disturbed by that. There are some critics who say, well, what Hermann Schmitz does is like a new form of mystical understanding of reality. And partly that might be true. And of course it depends on the individual and the ability and experience of being open to atmospheres or whatever. Of course, I mean, go with a group of school children in a museum, they don't pay attention to any of these pictures. They want to go outside and want to go home. But there are other people who will sense a whole lot in front of art. I mean, that's obvious, and that's true, yeah. I mean, yeah. Some are grasped by a picture, and others don't care.
Yes, I mean, you've got heterogeneity of response, but you've also probably got heterogeneity of atmosphere. So the idea that you could bottle a single atmosphere, if you see what I mean,
right,
and kind of supply it as a sort of intervention is probably unlikely.
Right.
And we've had a very atmospheric conversation this evening. Does anyone want to toss anything else in before I thank our speaker? Well, thank you very much. It's been a really, really interesting, stimulating talk and excursus in the discussion. So thank you very much.
I thank you for encouraging me to present this difficult German philosophy to an English-speaking audience. So might be a couple of years when you can read it much better. Thank you.